The morning in southern Tampa began with a piercing scream. The Harrisons' neighbor, Pearl Johnson, a widow, came to borrow a cup of sugar and discovered something that would forever change the quiet life on Magnolia Street. Meredith Davis pressed down on the gas pedal, rushing through the streets of Tampa. Summer had just begun, but the asphalt was already hot enough to fry an egg. The homicide detective had been with the police for 20 years, but every call still made her heart race, especially when she had to go to a colleague's address. The police car stopped in front of a single-story house with peeling paint and an old lawn. Police tape already surrounded the area, turning it into a crime scene in the middle of a normal working-class neighborhood. Meredith got out of the car and immediately felt the humid air clinging to her dark skin. "Detective Davis?" A young officer whose uniform looked too new called out to her. "The victim is in the bedroom." Meredith nodded, pulling on latex gloves. "What about Anthony? Was he called?" The officer shifted from foot to foot. "That's the problem, Detective. The victim is his wife, Lucretia Garrington, and Detective Garrington himself is nowhere to be found." Meredith froze. Anthony had been her partner for almost 5 years before he was transferred to the Vice Squad. They had investigated dozens of murders together. He was a strict professional, sometimes reserved, but always reliable. "How long have you been trying to reach him?" "Since 7 this morning, ma'am. His phone is off and he's not at the station." The Garringtons' house looked modest but neat inside. Framed photographs, artificial flowers in vases, an old sofa with a knitted cover. Everything suggested that people of modest means but with a desire to create a cozy home lived here. Meredith walked down the hallway, noting the first signs that something terrible had happened. An overturned table, a broken vase, drops of blood on the beige carpet. She stopped at the bedroom door, where forensic technicians were already at work, photographing and collecting evidence. A woman lay on the bed. She was dark-skinned, slender, with long braids scattered across the pillow. Her neck was twisted strangely, and her face was frozen in an expression of horror and surprise. Bruises on her neck clearly indicated strangulation. "Preliminary cause of death is asphyxiation," said the forensic technician without looking up from his work. "But there are other injuries, multiple bruises, abrasions on her hands, broken nails." She struggled. Meredith walked around the room, trying not to disturb the technicians. The bedside table had been overturned, the lamp smashed, and there was a mark on the wall where it had been hit. "When did she die?" "Between 10 p.m. yesterday and 2 a.m., replied the forensic scientist. "Taliaferro will be able to say more after the autopsy." Meredith left the bedroom and headed for the bathroom. The mess was even more noticeable here. The mirror above the sink was broken. Shards were everywhere, some of them covered in blood. Cosmetic tubes were scattered across the floor. Towels had been torn from the hooks. "Did you collect blood samples?" she asked the technician who was carefully packing the bloody mirror shards. "Yes, ma'am. Preliminary tests indicate that it's not the victim's blood. It may belong to the attacker." "Check it against Anthony Garrington," Meredith said, feeling her stomach clench at the thought that her former partner could be a murderer. Returning to the living room, she found that new officers had arrived, including Lieutenant Clark, the head of the homicide division. "Davis," he nodded. "What do we have?" "Lucretia Garrington, 34 years old, strangled in her own bedroom. Signs of a struggle throughout the house. Anthony is nowhere to be found." The lieutenant shook his head. "I can't believe Garrington. He was always a model cop." "I know," Meredith replied quietly. "But the facts speak for themselves. We need to talk to the neighbors. Maybe someone saw or heard something." They stepped outside, where a small crowd of onlookers had already gathered. The heat was intensifying, and many neighbors stood under umbrellas to protect themselves from the scorching Florida sun. Meredith approached an elderly woman who had discovered the body. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm Detective Davis. Please tell me what happened this morning." Pearl Johnson wiped her forehead with a handkerchief and took a deep breath. "I came to borrow a cup of sugar from Lucretia. We sometimes do that, help each other out with little things. The door was ajar. I called out to her, but no one answered. I thought maybe she was in the shower or couldn't hear me. I went inside and..." The woman stumbled and found her there. poor girl. Did you hear anything unusual last night? Pearl frowned, trying to remember. Yes, they were arguing, loudly. I heard shouting at about 10 o'clock. It was strange because they're usually quiet. Anthony is always so polite and calm. But last night, he was yelling like a madman. Did you hear what they were arguing about? No, I couldn't make out the words, but it went on for about an hour. Then everything went quiet, and I figured they had made up. Pearl shook her head. I never would have thought Anthony capable of that. He's a police officer. Meredy thanked the woman and questioned several other neighbors. The story was the same. Everyone had heard a loud argument the night before, and no one had seen Anthony since. When she returned to the house, she found forensic investigators searching the bedroom. Detective, take a look, one of the technicians called to her, pointing to a small safe hidden in the closet. We opened it. There are documents in there that may be relevant to the case. Meredy put on a fresh pair of gloves and took the folder the technician handed her. Inside were medical records in the name of Anthony Garrington. She quickly scanned them and felt the blood drain from her face. The test results, dated 3 weeks earlier, confirmed a positive HIV status. The folder also contained prescriptions for antiretroviral drugs and referrals for additional tests. Damn, Meredy whispered. He found out just 3 weeks ago. She remembered how Anthony had changed recently. He had become irritable, often took days off work, and avoided interacting with his colleagues. At the time, she had attributed it to fatigue or family problems. Now the picture was becoming clearer. Lieutenant, she called to Clark, we need to put out an APB for Anthony. This was no longer just the disappearance of the victim's spouse. While the police were finishing up at the crime scene, Meredy went out onto the porch and dialed a number. Taliaferro? This is Davis. We have a body and need an autopsy done immediately. There's something you should know before you get started. At the same time, 100 miles from Tampa, a black Ford was traveling down Interstate 75. Anthony Garrington was behind the wheel. His hands, clenched around the steering wheel, were covered in abrasions and caked blood. His eyes, usually alert and calm, now seemed empty, as if the life had left them. Fragments of memories came flooding back to him. He found the folder with the documents in Lucrezia's old box. They were shouting at each other in the bedroom. Her face was contorted with fear and anger. His hands were around her neck, squeezing tighter and tighter. Anthony turned on the radio, trying to drown out the voices in his head. The music didn't help. Nothing could drown out the sound of breaking neck vertebrae that still rang in his ears. He knew they were looking for him. He knew it was pointless to run, but he couldn't bring himself to stop and give up. Not now. First, he had to get to a certain place, a place where he had once been happy, before his whole world had fallen apart. Ford continued north, taking Anthony further away from his wife's body, which was already being loaded into the coroner's van. At the Tampa morgue, Zohan Taliaferro was preparing the instruments for the autopsy. Tall, with long arms and calm eyes, he was known for his thoroughness and attention to detail. When he received the call from Meredy, he knew immediately that this case would be special. When Lucretia Garrington's body was delivered to the morgue, Zohan met the van at the service entrance. He personally supervised the transfer of the body and began preparing for the procedure. Dr. Taliaferro, his assistant said, Detective Davis asked you to start immediately and report back to her as soon as possible. Zohan nodded. He knew Anthony Garrington personally. They often crossed paths at work and sometimes even played basketball together in the police league. The thought that Anthony could have killed his wife seemed absurd, but Zohan had long since learned that in his profession, one must not jump to conclusions. Putting on his protective suit, mask, and gloves, he turned on the tape recorder. Autopsy of the body identified as Lucretia Garrington, 34 years old. June 18th, 10:30 a.m., conducted by Dr. Zohan Taliaferro. He approached the body covered with a sheet and froze for a moment. Then he decisively threw back the cloth, ready to reveal the secrets held by the dead body. Zohan Taliaferro always approached his work with the methodical precision of a scientist and respect for those who ended up on his table. In his 15 years as a forensic pathologist, he had learned to see dead bodies not only as objects of study, but also as the final pages of human stories. The story of Lucretia Garrington promised to be particularly tragic. He carefully recorded the external injuries, multiple bruises on the neck, broken nails, abrasions on the hands. He photographed, measured, and dictated his observations into a recording device. It was a classic picture of a violent struggle before death. "Time of death approximately between 10 p.m. and midnight," he said into the microphone. "Cause of death: asphyxiation due to compression of the neck, fracture of the hyoid bone, damage to the laryngeal cartilage." When the initial examination was complete, Zohan began the main autopsy procedure. It was at this moment that he discovered the first anomaly. Something about the structure of the victim's pelvis seemed unusual to him. He paused, looked more closely at the genitals, then took a scalpel for a more thorough examination. "Traces of surgical intervention have been found," he dictated, feeling his pulse quicken with professional curiosity. "The nature of the operation indicates vaginoplasty. The subject, identified as Lucretia Harrington, has presumably undergone gender reassignment surgery." Zohan stepped back from the table, removed his stained gloves, and put on a new pair. He needed to verify his hunch. He took tissue samples for histological analysis, but he was already almost certain of his discovery. Over the years, he had dealt with the bodies of transgender people, and the signs were familiar to him. Returning to the body, he continued the autopsy, finding new evidence to support his theory: scar tissue in the lower abdomen, the absence of a uterus and ovaries, and signs of hormone therapy. "Everything indicates that Lucretia Harrington was previously anatomically male," he concluded. "The operation was performed professionally, presumably at least 5 to 7 years ago." Finishing the autopsy, Zohan took off his protective suit and headed for the phone. He needed to urgently inform Meredy Davis of his discovery. It could be the key to understanding the motive for the murder. Meredy received Zohan's call while reviewing Anthony Garrington's personal file at the station. An impeccable career, awards for bravery, not a single complaint from citizens. The perfect cop, except for a certain aloofness. "Davis," she answered the call. "This is Taliaferro. I need to talk to you urgently about Lucretia Garrington, preferably in person." Something in his voice made Meredy tense. "How urgent is it?" "Very. It changes everything." 20 minutes later, Meredy was entering Zohan's office in the morgue building. The medical examiner looked puzzled and excited at the same time. "What did you find?" she asked without preamble. Zohan picked up a folder with a preliminary report from the table. "Lucretia Garrington was formerly a man," he said bluntly. "I found clear signs of surgical sex reassignment. Very high quality, by the way." Meredy slowly sank into a chair. "This news required some processing. Are you sure?" "Absolutely. I've sent tissue samples for analysis, but even without them, I'm 99% certain." Zohan handed her the folder. "Here, look at the photos. Here and here you can see characteristic traces of surgery. And this is an X-ray showing the structure of the pelvis. Typically male." Meredy studied the materials, trying to connect the new information with what she already knew about the murder. "Did Anthony know about this?" "That's your area, detective." Zohan shrugged. "But if he didn't know, you might have a motive." Meredy nodded, especially in combination with Anthony's recently discovered HIV status. "We need to find her medical records, find out about her past. You said the surgery was performed at least 5 to 7 years ago?" "My guess is yes, maybe even earlier. The tissue has completely healed. The scars are old." "Thanks, Zohan. This really changes everything." Leaving the morgue, Meredy immediately called the station. "I need all the information on Lucretia Garrington. Place of birth, education, medical history, and check the name Lucas Johnson in the New Orleans databases. I have reason to believe that may have been her former name." The next stop in the investigation was the Amani Beauty Salon in the Ybor City neighborhood. According to information from neighbors, Lucretia had worked there as a hairdresser for the past 4 years, and the salon's owner, Imani Brooks, was a close friend of hers. The salon was located in an old brick building with a bright sign and a window decorated with photos of stylish hairstyles. Despite it being a weekday, it was busy inside. Several customers were waiting their turn, flipping through magazines or looking at their phones. Meredy approached the reception desk. "Detective Meredy Davis, Tampa Police Department. I need to talk to Imani Brooks." The young woman behind the counter opened her eyes wide in alarm. and pointed to a door at the back of the salon. "She's in her office." Imani Brooks was a slender woman with intricately styled dreadlocks and flawless makeup. When she saw Merity's police badge, she frowned. "This is about Lucretia, isn't it? I heard. That's terrible." "I need to ask you a few questions, Miss Brooks. In private, if possible." Imani nodded and closed the office door. "What do you want to know?" "How long did you know Lucretia?" "Almost 8 years. We met in New Orleans at cosmetology school. Then I moved here, opened a salon, and she came a little later and started working for me." Merity watched Imani's expression closely. "Did you know she used to be a man?" Imani flinched, but quickly regained her composure. "I don't understand what you're talking about." "Miss Brooks, this is important for the murder investigation. The autopsy revealed that Lucretia had undergone sex reassignment surgery. You were close friends for 8 years. You must have known." Imani was silent, fingering the gold bracelet on her wrist. Finally, she sighed. "Yes, I knew. She confided her secret to me back in New Orleans. We became friends precisely because I accepted her for who she was." "Her real name was Lucas Johnson?" "Yes, but she never considered it real. For her, Lucretia was always real, just trapped in the wrong body." Merity took out her notebook. "Tell me everything you know about her past. When did she have the surgery? Did anyone else know?" Imani shook her head. "She was very secretive about it. She had the surgery in Thailand about 8 years ago. She saved up for it for years. Then she moved to New Orleans to start a new life where no one knew about her past." "What about Anthony? Did he know?" Imani tensed. "No, she never told him. She was afraid of his reaction. He's a cop, pretty conservative. Lucretia loved him and was afraid of losing him. They were together for 6 years, married for 4, and all that time she hid such an important part of her life." "You don't understand," Imani leaned forward. "For someone like Lucretia, every new acquaintance is a risk. You never know how a person will react. And Anthony, he was her chance at a normal life, at a family. She didn't want to ruin everything." Merity made a few notes. "Do you think Anthony would have killed her if he had found out the truth?" Imani thought for a moment. "I don't know. He always seemed calm, even tempered. But sometimes it's people like that who explode the most when their world falls apart." "What about HIV? Was Lucretia infected?" Imani's eyes widened. "What? No, not as far as I know. She got tested regularly. She was very careful about her health, especially considering all the hormones she had to take. That was an interesting twist. If Lucretia wasn't HIV positive, then where did Anthony get the virus? And did she know about his diagnosis?" "One last question, Miss Brooks. Did Lucretia ever express fear of Anthony? Did they have serious problems in their relationship?" Imani shook her head. "She was never afraid of him. On the contrary, she always said how attentive and caring he was. But lately, she had noticed that he had become distant and irritable. She was worried that he might have found out about her past or maybe met another woman." As she left the salon, Merity felt she had picked up some important pieces of the puzzle, but the full picture was still elusive. More news awaited her at the station. Anthony Garrington had been found. He had turned himself into the police in a small town 3 hours away from Tampa. He was being transported back for questioning. By the time Merity arrived, Anthony was already sitting in the interrogation room. Emaciated and with a vacant stare, he was a shadow of the confident detective she had known. "Anthony," she began, sitting down across from him. "I'm here not only as a detective, but as your friend. Tell me what happened." He looked up, but it was as if he were looking through her. "I killed her," he said in a lifeless voice. "Arrest me and get it over with. We need to know the details." "Why did you do it?" Anthony shook his head and fell silent again. All of Merity's attempts to get him to talk were futile. He didn't respond to persuasion or provocation. After 2 hours of unsuccessful attempts, Merity decided to change tactics. "We found your medical records, Anthony. We know your diagnosis. And something else was discovered during Lucrezia's autopsy." For the first time during the entire interrogation, a flash of interest appeared in his eyes, but he quickly suppressed it. "I won't talk without a lawyer," he finally said. While Anthony waited for his court-appointed defense attorney, forensic investigators examined his car. In the trunk, they found bloody clothes, and under the passenger seat, a heavy statuette with traces of blood and Lucrezia's hair. Presumably, this was the object Anthony used to strike his wife before strangling her. Blood analysis on the broken mirror in the bathroom confirmed that it belonged to Anthony. The examination also established a match between the marks on Lucrezia's neck and Anthony's hands. The technical evidence of his guilt was irrefutable. Meredy decided to check one more lead. She went to the clinic where Anthony was being treated for HIV. After presenting her warrant, she was given access to his medical records. "The patient first came to us on April 27th, explained Dr. Ramirez, looking through the records. "He came in after receiving a positive test result. He was in shock, like most new patients. We prescribed antiretroviral therapy and conducted the necessary tests." "Did he say how he might have been infected?" The doctor shook his head. "Doctor-patient confidentiality, detective. But I can say that he attended consultations regularly and took his medication. He was very depressed, but trying to fight it." "Did he mention his wife? Did he say she might be infected too?" "He said his wife didn't know about his diagnosis. He was afraid to tell her." The doctor hesitated. "And yes, he expressed concern that he might have infected her. We recommended that he tell her and bring her in for an examination, but he kept putting off the conversation." "When was the last time you saw him?" "The day before yesterday. He looked unstable. He mentioned some documents he had found about betrayal. I suggested he see a psychologist, but he refused." Meredy thanked the doctor and left the clinic. Now she was beginning to understand what had happened. Anthony had learned about his HIV status and decided that he had been infected by his wife, his only sexual partner. Then he accidentally discovered the truth about Lucrezia's past. 2 shocking discoveries, 2 betrayals. For a man with his rigid view of the world, it was too much. Back at the station, Meredy learned that Lucrezia's tissue test results confirmed that she was HIV negative. This meant that Anthony had been infected by someone else. Perhaps he had an affair that no one knew about. Detective Davis gathered all the case files in preparation for a new round of questioning Anthony, this time in the presence of a lawyer. She had to find out the whole truth about the Harrington marriage and that fateful night when the secrets hidden by both spouses led to a tragic end. Anthony Harrington spent 3 days in a holding cell, refusing to talk to anyone, including his lawyer. For 3 days, Meredy Davis gathered evidence to present an irrefutable picture of what had happened. On the 4th day, something changed. Anthony asked to see Meredy, alone. "That's against protocol," objected his lawyer, an elderly man with tired eyes. "Anything you say can be used against you." "I don't care," Anthony replied. "I want her to know the truth." The interrogation room was cold. Merritt turned on the tape recorder and noted the date and time. June 22nd, 2:37 p.m. Interrogation of suspect Anthony Garrington. Present, Detective Meredy Davis and Attorney Gerald Townsend. Anthony sat across from her, handcuffed. His eyes, usually lively and alert, seemed dull. He looked as if he had aged 10 years in the last few days. "I'm listening, Anthony," Meredy said softly. He took a deep breath. "I want you to know that this wasn't planned. I didn't mean to kill her. It just happened." Meredy nodded without interrupting. "We met 6 years ago in a bar. I'd never been particularly lucky with women. Too focused on work, too serious. But she was vibrant. She laughed at my stupid jokes. She seemed interested in what I had to say." Anthony smiled at the memory, but the smile quickly faded. "I fell in love quickly. She was more cautious. She said she'd been hurt in the past and was afraid to trust again. We dated for almost a year before she agreed to move in with me. Another year passed before we got married." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "She was always a little secretive about her past. She said she grew up in New Orleans, that her parents were dead, that she hadn't been in a serious relationship before me. I didn't ask many questions. I figured everyone was entitled to their secrets." Meredy watched him, noticing how his expression changed as he recalled the memories, from tenderness to bitterness. "A month ago, I went for a routine medical checkup. Just routine, nothing special. A week later, I got a call from the clinic. They said I needed to come in right away. The doctor told me I had tested positive for HIV. His voice faltered. I was in shock. I couldn't understand how it was possible. I didn't do drugs. I didn't have casual relationships. Lucretia was my only partner for the past 6 years. The doctor said I needed to start treatment immediately and that Lucretia should get tested too. Anthony shook his head. I couldn't bring myself to tell her. I went to the clinic in secret, took my medication, hid it. All I could think about was how to tell my wife that I was HIV positive, how to ask her if she had infected me. He clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I became suspicious. I started thinking that maybe she was cheating on me. Maybe she had another life that I didn't know about. I looked for evidence, checked her phone when she was asleep, followed her after work. "And what did you find?" Meredy asked. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. She went from home to work and back. Sometimes she met up with her friends from the salon. No secret lovers, no strange phone calls." Anthony closed his eyes for a moment, as if diving into his memories. That evening, I decided to check our storage room. There were boxes of her things that she had brought when she moved in with me. Boxes I had never opened. In one of them, I found a folder with documents. A birth certificate for Lucas Johnson, medical records for hormone therapy, photos of Lucretia before her transition. His voice became muffled. I sat there among the boxes and felt my whole world collapse. The woman I had loved for 6 years, shared a bed with, trusted, had been a man. And she never told me. A heavy silence hung in the interrogation room. Meredy waited, not interrupting his story. When she came home, I showed her the documents. At first, she denied it. Then she cried and begged me to understand. She said she was afraid of my reaction, that she loved me, that she had always felt like a woman trapped in a man's body. Anthony swallowed hard. And then I asked her about HIV. I showed her my test results. I asked if she knew she was infected. His eyes filled with tears. She confessed, Meredy. She said she knew about her status before we met, that she was infected during the operation in Thailand from contaminated blood, that she was afraid to tell me because I would have left her. Meredy frowned. But the autopsy showed that Lucretia wasn't HIV positive. Anthony stared at her in shock. What? That's impossible. She told me herself. Maybe she lied to take the blame, Meredy suggested. Or maybe you misunderstood her in the heat of the moment. No, Anthony shook his head. She clearly said she knew her status, that she had been taking medication all these years, hiding it from me. That's why she always insisted on safe sex. Meredy made a note. This point required further investigation. What happened next? Anthony lowered his head. I was furious. I felt betrayed, deceived. My whole life with her seemed like a lie. I yelled. She yelled. She said it was my fault, that if I hadn't been so conservative and closed off, she could have told me the truth, that I had cornered her with my expectations of the perfect wife. His voice became barely audible. I hit her. For the first time in my life, I hit a woman. She fell and hit her head on the bedside table. Then she got up and lunged at me with a lamp. She smashed it over my head. He pointed to a faint scar above his left temple. We fought. We really fought. We knocked over furniture, broke things. At one point, I grabbed a figurine and hit her with it. She fell down. I thought she had just lost consciousness. But then she started to get up and there was such fear in her eyes. And hatred. Anthony trembled. I grabbed her by the throat. I just wanted her to stop screaming, to stop saying all those things. I squeezed and she scratched my hands trying to get away. And then something cracked, and she went limp. He covered his face with his hands. I didn't mean to kill her. I swear, I didn't. Meredy turned off the tape recorder. The confession had been obtained. Now she needed to check the final details. Back at the station, she requested a warrant to seize Lucretia's computer from the Garringtons' home. The tech department quickly cracked the password and discovered a personal diary that Lucretia had been keeping for the past 3 years. Meredy spent several hours reading the entries. The story Anthony had told her began to take on new shades. The diary revealed that Lucretia was indeed HIV positive. She had been infected during gender reassignment surgery in Thailand, just as Anthony had said. But unlike his version, Lucretia wrote that she had been undergoing regular treatment, taking antiretroviral drugs, and maintaining an undetectable viral load. The level of the virus in her blood was so low that it could not be detected by standard tests and could not be transmitted through protected sex. That is why the autopsy did not reveal the presence of HIV. The treatment had been effective. But Lucrezia never told Anthony about her past or her status, fearing his reaction. In her last entries, dated a few days before her death, Lucretia wrote about her suspicions that Anthony was hiding something, that he had become distant and irritable, that she was afraid he might find out the truth. In her last entry, made on the day of her murder, she wrote, "I think he knows something. I found my old box of documents in a different place. I'm afraid to go home. What if he found everything? What if he hates me? I can't lose him. He's my whole life." Meredy closed the laptop. Now she understood what had happened. Two secrets. Two people hiding the truth from each other for fear of being rejected. And a tragic ending that could perhaps have been prevented if they had just talked honestly. Anthony Garrington's trial began 3 months later. Given his confession and the irrefutable evidence, the trial was relatively short. The defense tried to prove that the murder was committed in the heat of passion, that Anthony was acting under the influence of intense emotional turmoil after the double revelation of the truth. The prosecution insisted on premeditated murder, pointing out that several hours had passed between the discovery of the documents and Lucrezia's return home, enough time for emotions to subside and Anthony to control his actions. In the end, the jury found Anthony guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Meredy attended every court hearing. She saw her former partner, once a proud and strong man, reduced to a shadow of his former self. She saw him cry when the prosecutor read the last entries from Lucretia's diary. She saw him whisper, "I'm sorry," silently when photos from the crime scene were shown. 3 months passed after the verdict before Meredy decided to visit Anthony in prison. She wasn't sure why she was going. Perhaps to find some closure for herself. Perhaps to understand if there was anything she could have done to prevent the tragedy. Anthony looked different in his prison uniform. He had lost weight, his hair had grown out, and he had new wrinkles around his eyes. But when he smiled at her, Merritt recognized the Anthony she had known, her partner, her friend, the man she had trusted with her life. "Thank you for coming," he said, sitting down across from her at the visitor's table. "How are you?" she asked, not knowing what else to say. "Just taking it one day at a time," he shrugged. "Taking my meds, seeing a psychologist, trying to understand how it all went wrong." They were silent for a moment. "I think about her a lot," Anthony finally said, "about how she must have felt all those years, hiding the truth about herself. How scary it must have been to love someone and be afraid that they would reject you if they found out who you really were." Meredy nodded. "And you? You hid your truth too?" "Yes," he admitted. "But I only hid it for a month. She hid it for years. I don't know if I could have lived that long with a secret like that." "Do you think she really infected you?" Anthony shook his head. "Now I know she didn't. The doctors here ran some additional tests. Apparently I was infected several months before I found out about my diagnosis. Maybe during the police operation. There was a wound, contact with the suspect's blood. Or maybe in the hospital when I donated blood for a wounded colleague. They can't say for sure." He smiled bitterly. "It's ironic. We were both HIV positive, both hiding it from each other, both afraid of rejection. If we had just talked..." "If only," Meredy echoed. When visiting time came to an end, Anthony asked unexpectedly, "Do you think I could have accepted her? If I hadn't found out the truth like that? If she had told me everything at the beginning?" Meredy looked at him intently. "I don't know, Anthony. Only you do, and now you'll have plenty of time to think about it." As she left the prison, Meredy thought about the fragments of truth that had emerged during the investigation, about how people build walls of lies and omissions to protect themselves from pain, and how those walls ultimately cause even more pain. She thought about Lucrezia, who wanted so desperately to be loved that she chose to hide the most important parts of herself. About Anthony, whose rigidity and fear of difference made it impossible for his wife to open up to him. The Garrington story was a story about how secrets and lies can destroy lives, about how the fear of rejection can lead to real tragedy, about how important it is to tell the truth to those we love, even if that truth scares us. The sun was setting over Tampa when Meredy got into her car. She rolled down the window, feeling the warm evening breeze on her face. Life went on, for her, but not for Lucrezia, and not for the Anthony she once knew. They had both become victims of the secrets they tried to keep.